Good afternoon. I was saying earlier to our esteemed guests that it's like Sorolla has a bunch of groupies, because I know that many of you travel around and are all about Sorolla and are very interested in learning more about him and can't get enough of him, and we've discovered what a popular appeal he has. So it is my privilege to introduce our speakers today and welcome you all to participate in this wonderful Sorolla exhibition symposium. We hope that after the symposium today, after today's program, you'll join us for a reception. So at 5 o'clock, after we'll reconvene across the hall over in Jones, where we'll have a reception, and then welcome you, of course, to visit the galleries until 6:30. So we will also have, the shop will be open, and you can purchase catalogs, and Blanca Poncerolla has been very generous and agreed to do book signings during the reception if you're interested in getting one of those special. That's very, very nice of you. Thank you. I'm Carmen Smith. I'm the Director of Education, and as I said, it's really a privilege to welcome you all today. I should let you know, too, that I think a number of you have reservations for the Orchestra of New Spain performance this evening. If you do not have a reservation, I'm so sorry, they're not accepting anymore, and there's not even standing room. So we hope that you will stay for the at least to visit the exhibition and stay with us through the reception. I just wanted to turn this over now to our director, Mark Roglan, to say a few words and to welcome our first guest today, very special curator. Mark?
Well, thank you, Carmen, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm very honored to introduce the moderator today of the symposium, which is at this point, she's part of our staff, I think, which is Blanca Poncerolla, the curator of the exhibition and a dear friend for many years. I had the privilege of working on the Resonate catalog many years ago, and now that it's really a dream come true to do this exhibition on Sorolla in America. Also, there's major speakers tonight, major scholars on Spanish art that will be sharing with us their knowledge. And I think it's one of the things that Blanca and I decided when we were working on this show is that we want to have as many voices as possible talking about Sorolla. So none of the people that contributed in the catalog were invited to be part of the symposium. So we wanted other scholars to also share their understanding and appreciation for this artist. So anyways, without further ado, I just wanted to welcome to the Meadows Museum, and I would like to invite to the podium Blanca Poncerolla, the curator of the Sorolla in America exhibition. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The public response to Sorolla's rendering of nature, fresh air, beaches, the sun, especially the sun, were well documented in the American press in 1909 and 1911. Here is what some of them had to say. Perhaps Sorolla's greatest contribution to art is that he got people to see and appreciate nature in a different way, any way. There is something miraculous in the way that Sorolla makes his figure come to life. The public appreciate his reflection of the beauty in everyday things. They like to recognize, trust sample subject in the paintings. They appreciate the representation of attitudes that are familiar to them. Thanks to Sorolla, the American public has discovered the virtue of the Impressionist painting. He has gotten the public to understand that if the painting were more finished, with more detail, they wouldn't lose their vitality and ability to convince. The viewer's eyes would be distracted with a multiplicity of detail instead of concentrating on the essence of the essence. Joaquín Sorolla's mind and hand move in concert, in perfect connection. There are no signs of hesitation or doubt in his paintings. His brush strokes are clean and sure, and his vigor and confidence captive the public. In Sorolla's paintings, his capacity for observation works is tandem with the virtuosity of his technique. In addition to being natural, these paintings are stimulating because he infused his image with his personal interpretation of beauty and the value of the life. As we said in the beginning, what press emphasized most was Sorolla's exceptional ability to capture light. Many writers noted the unique way in which he carried this out without resorting to the impressionist technique of disintegration, colors, and shapes. Allow me to show some more quotes. His interpretation of light is more real and vivid than Monet's, and his light is the light of the south. He has achieved what no one else has before. He opened the window through which we can see Spain and our childhood in a new light. Sorolla is the painter of the light par excellence. Neither Turner nor Manet managed to paint rays of sun as blinding as those of Sorolla. Sorolla is not a thinker. He is a painter of luminous morning, of brick salty breezes. He is half Greek. Sorolla, however, would write, "We painters can never capture the light of the sun as it really is. We can only come close." Compared to these light-filled representations of nature, his portraits had a cooler reception. However, these works were constantly used to illustrate articles, and in some cases, such as that of Clotilde seated on a sofa, which is in this exhibition, it was said that Sargent would have been no match. Joaquín Sorolla was largely unknown to the public when he arrived in New York in 1909 with 350 paintings. With his honesty as an artist, his patriotism, and his enormous pictorial ability, he was a true revelation. The press used the same adjective to describe Sorolla in 1906 when he exhibited in Paris, the center of the art world at that time. The exhibition Sorolla in America is the result of one exhaustive study of the presence of Sorolla in America before his arrival of 1909, of the development of his exhibits in New York, Buffalo, and Boston that same year, and of St. Louis and Chicago in 1911. And also of the works he exhibited and sold in the United States, of his close relationship with his two great patrons, Archer Minton Huntington and Thomas Fortune Ryan, and finally, of the more than 50 portraits that he painted in American subject, of the astonishing success of his exhibits, and of the enormous repercussion that he had in the newspaper and at world press. In 1909, when Sorolla showed his painting at the Hispanic Society of America, there was at the same time a magnificent collection of works by contemporary German masters being shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And at the Brooklyn Museum, there was a splendid exhibition of watercolors by John Singer Sargent. While both of these other exhibitions were very well received, they did not stop 160,000 people from visiting Huntington's Distance Museum in less than a month. Neither of the other two exhibits produced close to the same attendance or the media success that Sorolla exhibition did. The unprecedented phenomenon which brought acclaim to Sorolla to the Hispanic Society of America was due to a confluence of events that have been in a large part discussed in the exhibition catalog essays, but about which much more can still be said. This symposium will analyze the impact of Sorolla's work in America from three different points of view. Marcus Berg, Senior Curator of the Hispanic Society of America, and his presentation, The Right Time at the Right Place, Sorolla and the Hispanic Society of America, will analyze the reasons for the enthusiasm of Sorolla, first and most important patron in America, Archer Milton Huntington, founder of the Hispanic Society of America. Dr. Burke will also discuss the unprecedented success of the New York exhibition of 1909 and of the others sponsored later in Buffalo and Boston that same year, and in St. Louis and Chicago in 1911. Alisa Luxemburg, professor of the 18th and 19th century European art of the University of Georgia, will present Sorolla and La Españolada, in search of the authentic Spain. From a different point of view, she will also discuss the keys to this success. And finally, we will hear from Lucia Martinez Valverde, conservator of 19th century paintings from the Prado in Madrid, who has successfully restored some of the paintings in this exhibition. In her presentation, The Restoration of Masterwork by Joaquín Sorolla, The Rediscovery of the Light, she will reveal the keys to understanding the artist's creative process, which will also help us to understand what the American public saw and felt and what it was, what amazed and moved them. I would like to thank first of all the participants. Thanks also to the Meadows Museum, to the Meadows Foundation, and to SMU for making this symposium possible. And thanks to you all for being here with us.
Our first presenter is Marcus Burke. Marcus Burke is Senior Curator of the Museum Department of the Hispanic Society of America. Before joining the Society, he served as an art history professor in 10 schools, including the New York University Institute of Fine Arts, Yale University, the University of Texas, and Southern Methodist University, where incidentally he served as the chief curator and assistant director of this museum in the late 80s. His expertise has earned him the role as guest curator and consultant for numerous exhibitions throughout the country. And of course, his years at the Hispanic Society of America make Dr. Burke a noted scholar on the subject of Joaquín Sorolla's life and art. Today, he will speak to us about the relationship between the Society and the artist. Please join me in welcoming Marcus Burke.
Thank you. Good afternoon, thrill seekers. I have to start with acknowledging the people I'm about to rip off. For the past decade or more, Priscilla Muller, who's the curator emerita of the museum at the Hispanic Society, Mitchell Cotting, our executive director, Blanca Ponce-Sorolla, and I have been publishing articles and catalog essays about Sorolla and his relationship to the Hispanic Society and to its founder, Archer Milton Huntington. I owe everything to the other three, including what I'm about to share with you today. Archer Milton Huntington was born in 1870 and died in 1955. From the age of 12, when he read a book about the Roma, or gypsy people in Spain, he was fascinated by Hispanic culture. In 1892, for example, he made a study trip through Spain in the company of Professor Knapp of the Romance Language Department at Yale and Knapp's wife. He was so rich he didn't go to Harvard or Yale. They brought Harvard and Yale to him. By 1900, he'd already become an important philologist, poet, translator, and above all, book collector, as well as an owner of pictures. He had told his mother in the Louvre, on that same trip when he read the book about the Roma people, that he wanted to live in a museum. Now, he never lived in the Hispanic Society. He had really swell houses. He didn't need to build another one. And by the way, Elizabeth Gardner didn't really live in Fenway Court. She had another house in Boston and hung there when she was, entertaining and so forth. But Henry Clay Frick really did live in the Frick. He wanted to live in a museum. Now, his idea of a museum, as we'll see, included rare books, manuscripts, prints, and photos, as well as unique works of art. We like to think of him as Daniel Day-Lewis's older brother. He was well-fed, well-read, and well-bred, tall, dark, and handsome, and worth $3 billion. So what can't you love about that? In fact, he inherited the $3 billion in 1900. That's in today's money. It was a mere $153 million then. And in 1904, he founded the Hispanic Society of America, which is a free public library, rare books library, rare books and manuscripts library, print and photograph study collection, and a museum. We care for over 1 million objects dedicated to the arts, literatures, and cultures of ancient Iberia, medieval Iberia, including Islamic Iberia, Spain, Portugal, Latin America, the Philippines, and anywhere else that Spanish or Portuguese have been spoken languages. That does include Texas, so that we're not outside our exhibition mandate to have participated in this exhibition. Now, as you will know from visiting the exhibition, Sorolla first came to there was one other thing I wanted to say. He referred to his work as creating a poem of a museum. He was a philologist and translator and a poet of gifts, although very, very set in the Victorian aesthetic. And if you come to the Society, you see this amazing statue. If you go to Valencia or Sevilla or the California Palace of the Legion of Honor and a number of other places, you will see this statue, which was done by his second wife, Anna von Hyatt Huntington. And it shows the Cid, because he translated and made a critical edition of the poem of the Cid. So that what his view of what a museum was really a very holistic sort of thing. Now, in 1892, Sorolla's Otra Margarita had won the first prize at the Exposición Internacional de Bellas Artes in Madrid, and that Archer Milton Huntington had attended. It also repeated its triumph at the World's Columbian Exhibition at Chicago in 1893, and became the first work by Sorolla to enter an American public collection that year, the Washington University Art Museum in St. Louis. Other works exhibited at Chicago apparently entered private collections in 1893-94. The pattern set by Otra Margarita was repeated by Triste Herencia, or Sad Inheritance, which won a Grand Prix at the Exposition Universelle at Paris in 1900, which Huntington visited and pronounced a success. And it was honored again at the Madrid exhibition in 1901. It was then acquired in Spain and brought to New York along with another picture in 1902 by a Spanish expatriate named Jesus Vidal, and sold to John E. Berwind, who subsequently donated it to the Church of the Ascension in New York. Now, the Church of the Ascension is down at the bottom of Fifth Avenue, right before Washington Square. It's got amazing art inside it. And I, having nothing to do with art, but with the church, was working with the rector of the Church of the Ascension, and we were going through the building, and we went to the Sunday school meeting room, and I jumped about 3 feet in the air. There was more picture than room. Plus, when you consider the frame, which is, what, 200 kilos? How much does a frame weigh? It's a huge frame. It was really quite a surprise. And he said, what's going on? I said, well, this is Joaquin Sorolla. He said, oh, yeah, it says that up at the top. And they had no clue what it was. Huntington knew of Berwind. He was a businessman with interest in Puerto Rico and Cuba, and the brother of one of Collis Potter Huntington's, Archer's father, contemporaries and sometimes competitors. Sorolla subsequently painted Berwind's portrait in 1909. William Merritt Chase, who went to Spain to study Velázquez and so forth, and to whom Sorolla may have given a work in 1906, thought enough of Sorolla to take pupils there to study with him around 1896. He sent his pupils there in 1896 and took a group there in 1909. There was also another painter in Pennsylvania, a man named Alexander Harrison, who acquired a work from Sorolla at Paris in 1904 and donated it to the Philadelphia Museum. So in short, as someone vitally interested in the visual arts and Spanish culture, Huntington must have had a considerable awareness of Sorolla's role as the preeminent Spanish master of his time and one of the most famous artists internationally. And in fact, long before he established contact with Sorolla, Huntington had cultivated the relationships with many of the intellectual Spaniards who were also in Sorolla's circle. I show you here the El Greco scholar, Manuel Cosillo, on whom Huntington increasingly relied for advice about El Greco. One of the few mistakes that Archer Huntington made in the acquisition of works of art is he started out buying El Greco's kind of on the cheap side, and he got stung with some misattributions. Now, if this sounds vaguely familiar, it's not an atypical situation with a new collector. And that's why someone like Cosillo was so important to him. Now, he did very well. We have 6 autographed El Grecos now, so that he figured it out. But the point is that Cosillo is important to him. Then there was Benigno de la Vega Inclán y Flaquer, the second Marqués de la Vega Inclán, who was, I think we can describe as a cultural impresario. How many of you have been to Spain? Aha, preaching to the converted. How many of you stayed in a parador in Spain? Well, this fellow up here in a beautiful bust by Ben-Hur was the man who established the network of paradors as a way to create architectural restoration, improve tourism in Spain, and so forth. He was commissioner of tourism in Spain. He also founded 3 museums, largely underwritten by Mr. Huntington: the Casa Museo del Greco in Toledo, the Museo Romantico at Madrid, which is a fun little museum. It's sort of a house, sort of a, what do you call it when you reconstruct a room? Period room museum. Very interesting. And the Casa de Cervantes at Valladolid. In 1906, Sorolla painted an image of the interior of La Casa del Greco in Toledo 4 years before the former chartering of the institution in 1910. And in addition to documenting Sorolla's relationship with Vega Inclán, it also shows you what the house looked like before they spiffed it. These three museums were paid for with Mr. Huntington's money, and he restored the Synagogue of the Tránsito. So he's kind of a local hero in Toledo. They're going to have three exhibitions on El Greco this year. This is the 400th anniversary, thank you, of his, my math was slipping away there, 400th anniversary of his death. One's at the Prado, and the other two are going to be in Toledo. And all three of them are going to be very, very interesting and high quality. Then there is the foremost Impressionist painter, the foremost Spanish Impressionist painter and art historian, Aureliano de Berruete, who served as Sorolla's mentor and confidant and was known to Huntington as an art expert as well. There's a lot of correspondence from Berruete saying, "Hey, Huntington, I found another one." And Huntington would have to write back with Mr. Berruete, "I don't buy paintings in Spain." He didn't want to despoil the national patrimony. Now, what happened was he bought the most important collection of rare books in Spain early on in his career, and the outcry was so great that he took the pledge. But a robber baron, not wanting to despoil the national patrimony, didn't stop his mama and his cousin Henry Edwards Huntington taking the Blue Boy home, and Pinky and Mrs. Siddons as the tragic muse and so forth. Where am I absolutely love Aureliano de Berruete, and you've got some nice ones out there in the corridors. Really, really beautiful ones. An extremely important person in the establishment of the Hispanic Society was Raimundo de Madrazo, whose self-portrait you have here and other works, as I'm given to understand. He was the third generation of the Madrazo Fortuny artistic dynasty. Mark gave the most wonderful lecture in New York. Did you get that here too? This wonderful lecture on the social history and background and connections of the Madrazo family, who were an important conduit of Spanish art into America. I'm showing you here a portrait of Mrs. Virginie Migeon Swift. Her industrialist but French-descended family back in Torrington, Connecticut called her Midgeon. And she was the wife of a prominent society doctor and professor at Columbia. The portrait was painted at New York in 1900, and your self-portrait, which you see on the right, was painted at New York in 1901. From the late 1890s, Madrazo came to New York to do society portraits, and that was something that picked up quite a bit as Sargent started saying no to portrait commissions. You know what John Singer Sargent's definition of a portrait was? It's a painting with something not quite right about the mouth. Here you see the day the Hispanic Society opened in 1908. This is Mr. Huntington. He was a big man, 6'3" or 4", we're not really sure which. Big bear of a man. Here is Raimundo de Madrazo. Here is Madrazo's second wife and her doggie, Maria Hahn. Raimundo Madrazo helped Huntington a great deal, and as the dealer representative of the Madrazo family, he also made sure that works such as the works of his father, Federico de Madrazo, came to the Hispanic Society, and also the works of Goya. Here you see on the left Goya's portrait of Mocarte, and on the right you see Fortuny's copy of the portrait that he made because the portrait was in the Madrazo family, and Fortuny married into the Madrazo family. These works came to the Society through Raimundo, as did a great many pictures by Fortuny himself, and also by artists such as Martín Rico y Ortega, whose estate Raimundo represented to American collectors. I think that's, maybe I'm pushing that in formal terms, but it's the de facto situation. This picture at the bottom, this beautiful view, we're pretty much all convinced it's the Guadarrama, right, Mark? Yeah. Siete Picos, or somewhere like that in the Guadarrama. That was in the exhibition here. And so there's another connection. Another person with whom, of whom Mr. Huntington was aware is Leonard Williams, a critic and historian who had published by 1908 a great many books in English on Spanish culture. Now, you have to remember, for Mr. Huntington, it didn't matter if they were published in Spanish, but for the general public in America, there was not a large bibliography of English language books on Spanish art and culture. It began to pick up after 1898 and the Spanish-American War and all that. But Leonard Williams was in the forefront of these publication efforts, and as we'll see, that's going to become rather important. Now, in 1908, Sorolla was asked to present an exhibition at the Grafton Galleries in London. And they had been founded, as you see, in 1893, and there was an extremely elegant public exhibition space. I don't know what to compare it to in modern terms. The Royal Academy in London does these things now, or the Petit Palais, and much bigger, of course, in Paris. But it was a really tony exhibition space for artists to be invited to exhibit in, but it was commercial. You could sell the art exhibited there, and I had these photographs of the Grafton Galleries, and I thought I'd show them to you just to show the sort of world Sorolla was beginning to move in after 1900. Sorolla's portraits of notable Spaniards exhibited among the pictures in his one-man show in London on May of 1908 not only drew Mr. Huntington's attention, but resulted in the American buying or attempting to buy several works. As Priscilla Muller has put it, Huntington may have sought to create a gallery of illustrious Spaniards to adorn his new library museum in New York. We should also remember that an important British institution, the National Portrait Gallery, had entered its new building at Trafalgar Square next to the National Gallery in 1896. So there was a precedent there for establishing a collection of portraits as a museum activity. Now, not far from Trafalgar Square, Huntington found a Spanish artist worthy to compare with the great portraitists of the past, such as Velázquez and Goya, and the present, such as Chase and Sargent, meaning William Merritt Chase and Sargent. Since Raimundo de Madrazo worked in Paris and was in any case beginning to get ill around this time, Huntington could not have counted on him to start a campaign of portraiture in Madrid. So that the logical person to go to, Madrazo, was in some ways not available. The three portraits that Huntington bought or sought to buy were precisely those of the scholars and cultural activists already mentioned above, Cossío, Vega Inclán, and Berruete. And in the event, he bought the Peppers, this wonderful painting that's in the gallery, one of the first pictures you see in the gallery, which Huntington probably considered ethnographic, describing the cultures of Spain. Now, I've actually seen artists on their knees in front of this picture. We have a string of people coming to make copies of this. That highlight on her shoulder is 4 brushstrokes, and it's really one, like a Japanese Zen calligraphy, like someone throwing a tea bowl. Just unbelievable show of bravura. The portrait on the left is a portrait of Vega Inclán, which we believe to have been in the exhibit in London, although it didn't come to the Society until the New York exhibit in 1909. The painting on the right of Cossío was bought at the 1908 London exhibit. And he also wanted to purchase this painting on the left of Aureliano de Berruete, done in 1902. Boy, here's curator envy. I wish the heck he had some kind of a picture. But instead, Sorolla convinced Berruete to let him make another portrait, which is the one we have. When he asked Berruete to do this, Sorolla was trying to be discreet, and Berruete looked at him and said, "What library are you painting this for?" He knew perfectly well where it was destined. We have a beautiful suite of works from the same period as your works here by Berruete that were in his will and were given to us by his son. Berruete is the great unknown artist of the Spanish 19th century. This man who worked with Sisley, who actually could deal with Cezanne and could paint a painting like this, that he's not in the history books is absolutely a crime. It's really one of the bad things about this focus exclusively on Paris. This is a very interesting photograph I discovered in the course of preparing this lecture. It shows King Alfonso XIII, the Marqués de Viana, the Marqués de Vega Inclán, and Sorolla in Sorolla's garden, which these rails were set up because Sorolla sponsored a retrospective memorial exhibition for Berruete when Berruete died in 1912. But you'll notice the same, well, Viana was an associate of Mr. Huntington too. You see the same group of people that Huntington was dealing with. Now, this is after the American exhibitions and so forth, but I just point that Sorolla's circle and Mr. Huntington's circle were very closely identical in Spain. Now, this portrait of Raimundo de Madrazo in his garden, either in Paris or at Versailles, was painted in 1906 when Sorolla had an exhibition in Paris, and it came to the Society later as a gift from the sitter, or from the sitter's wife, in fact. I might point out that Mr. Huntington was actively acquiring portraits through this whole period, and especially here you see some of our greatest hits, the Duchess of Alba, and this Cardinal by Velázquez, which came from a dealer, an Italian nobleman, I think. He called himself a count anyway, dealer in Paris named Trotti. And I'm beginning to pick up notices that people have meetings in Trotti's studio. Mark, did you ever pick up anything from a guy named Trotti? The name comes up because he's on a lot of provenances. In any case, this picture by Velázquez came out of Italy, and Trotti was the person who arranged for that. Just to show you two more Velázquez's that we have, the beautiful little girl. And the Olivares, which Mr. Huntington's mother bought for him for the tidy sum of $650,000 in 1922 or 23, and I think the inflation factor is 10 or 15, so it's big money. Now, the most important result of Huntington's visit to Sorolla's exhibition in London was not the purchase of pictures, but rather the idea that Sorolla should exhibit in the United States at the Hispanic Society of America. And the matter progressed with surprising speed. No sooner had they decided on it that they got going, they got the logistics. In December, Sorolla said, well, I can send so many pictures. He sent 340 pictures to New York, and they didn't arrive until the 24th of January for a February opening. And we have, there had been 500 in London. After frenzied around-the-clock hanging, they opened the first week of February. It was up for a month, opened at the 4th of February, 1909, and closed on the 8th of March, having been visited by 160,000 people. And in the middle of February, there was a snowstorm, and there was 3 feet of snow on the ground. And we're not downtown. We're way at the end of Manhattan, although there is a subway, of course. It's an astonishing number for the time, or even today. We'd love to get 160,000 in. I think we need to spend a moment reflecting on the reason for Sorolla's critical and popular success in America, apart from the obvious fact that he was a spectacular artist at the top of his game. I mean, there's just sheer quality. But there's other reasons, too. I'm sorry. Here's some pictures of the opening. And the cars lined up. Aren't they cute? Now, all this is built up now. You can't get up there. That building there is John James Audubon's farmhouse. Those of you who are interested in American art, this is all John James Audubon's farm in Upper Manhattan. Now, the reasons. Go over them rather quickly. There's a relationship to Impressionism. There are outdoor activities and that sort of thing. There's ethnography in an era when Americans were fascinated by Spain and Latin America. After 1898, well, Hearst Castle and Julia Morgan and the Mission style and all these shopping centers that look like the Alhambra. You've got one here. Kansas City was the first one. San Diego has them. The tradition of American artists going to Spain to study. There's a wonderful, wonderful article in the catalog by Elizabeth Boone on William Merritt Chase, and you should all read it. It's great American art history and its wonderful relationship to Spanish art history. Chase, Sargent, Hassam, there's quite a string of Americans going there. And then in portraiture, the relationship to Sargent, Anders Zorn, Raimundo de Madrazo, and a 40-year tradition that Mark has documented of Americans patronizing contemporary Spanish painting. Let's look at some of these now. The relationship to Impressionism is highly controversial on the point of view of scholars to this day. I guess my colleague Rick Bertel is going to have some ideas on this in a couple weeks, right? However, if you compare something like this painting of rocks at Javea of 1905 with a painting 20 years before by Monet, I think there's some essential similarities that can't be denied. Similarly, if you compare this same painting to a painting by a Fauve painter, remember the Fauve group, Louis Valtat, which is exactly contemporary and shows the same breaking up of the petite sensation, the small sensations of Impressionism into the larger, more post-Impressionist fragmentation of the surface. You get some similar aspects here, although always with Sorolla, as with Velázquez, not always, but most of the time with Sorolla, you get a very close relationship to the illusion of nature. But that's another matter. You get that in Pizarro as well. Here we have William Merritt Chase, who's clearly thinking of John Singer Sargent, who is thinking of Velázquez. In this picture of his wife and family in Shinnecock in Massachusetts, 1892. And, of course, Sargent, who is the capo scuola here, the head of the American school, doing El Jaleo. And we're going to have a little jaleo this afternoon, right? Have to whistle and stamp, everybody, in the Gardner Museum in Boston. And a painting that we have called The Spanish Dance, very Whistler-struck painting he painted in Spain in the 1870s. So there's really a lot of precedence here behind this. And I might say that this idea of outdoors, not plein air in the sense of painting out in the outdoors, but just being in the outdoors, athletic activities, going to the beach. What Blanca just said about the beauty of everyday life was very well established in American art. I'm showing here Thomas Eakins. Here we've got another 20-year jump. Already you see that sort of thing, and also the application of classical figure studies to these. So where if you go up to After the Bath upstairs, the young woman coming out of the ocean, you think, oh, how naturalistic, how vivid, how photographic almost, how beautiful with all the light, and then you realize it's Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Then you don't realize, but I'm telling you that the figure is taken from a Roman statue. And Eakins, who was an academic professor of art, and Sorolla, who was part of a group establishing a new progressive sort of education, they were aware of this. They were classically trained artists who adapted that and then seduced you into thinking you were looking at a bunch of guys at the swimming hole, where actually it was set up with a whole string of photographs and academic figure poses and so forth. Same thing with Sorolla. So it was easy for the Americans to do this. And when I started out 20 years ago going into this in depth, I thought the American press would have just gone savage on all these naked kids, right? No, they said it's a golden age. And they were picking up on the lack of prurient interest in the artist, too. And I think they appreciated that. I don't think there was any violation of Puritan aesthetics here. So, Not only was he a critical success, but of course the show resulted in a lot of commissions for portraits. And here you see Sorolla. Now he posed for this. This was a carte de visite as an advertising piece. Here he's in the studio of this man, William Starkweather, and he's painting Starkweather in this rather expressionist portrait to test American pigments, well, they're actually British and French pigments sold in America, Winsor Newton and so forth, but he wanted to make sure they were what he needed. Everywhere he went, he used local pigments. It's a really very interesting story, but somebody else can talk about that, maybe Lucia. So he subsequently portrayed President Taft, who you see upstairs, and in 1911 he would do other people like Tiffany. He also, all these sitters often bought his other paintings. And you see Thomas Fortune Ryan, for example, buying paintings. That's a typical result of these exhibits, which made Sorolla a rich man. Just to remind you, and I've had some technical difficulties translating these images from our computers to the computer here, so you'll have to forgive some. Well, anyway, the ghost of Ignacio Zuloaga will have to forgive some of these images. The Sorolla exhibit was followed by a smaller exhibition of Zuloaga's works. And in fact, it was originally going to be a two-man show, but they had to split it up because there was so much. And here's some of the works from Zuloaga in that point, and subsequent acquisitions. Also, there's an interesting effect of the 1909 show in that Childe Hassam, who had gone to Spain earlier to study Velázquez, returned to the south of Spain in 1910, inspired by Sorolla's exhibition. He in turn exhibited in 1911 in New York, where Sorolla saw his pictures and recommended them to Mr. Huntington, and we have a number of them. They're really very beautiful. Did anybody here see the Hassam exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum, which was some kind of show, wasn't it? And they had a whole room of these Spanish pictures in their custom-made Carrigrohan Hassam frames. If you look at this picture and go upstairs and look at the pictures from the Alhambra and the Alcázar in Seville, you're going to see that Hassam really is using Sorolla as a template. Now, another show happened in 1911, but not at the Society. The Society produced it, but it went to Chicago and St. Louis. And again, Starkweather, who's seen in this rather not at all worthy portrait, he was a marvelous artist and art educator. He went with the Sorollas, and here they are at St. Louis in one of these photo op things. And they have that look that we all have when forced to do something like this. What are we doing here? You know, we're going to look so ridiculous. Anyway, just at that time, he portrayed Louis Comfort Tiffany in this marvelous and I think entirely impressionistic portrait for Laurelton Hall, Tiffany's house. That's his dog, Funny. And then this beautiful family portrait of Mrs. Ira Nelson Morris, née Lily Constance Rothschild. Her sister married Solomon Guggenheim. It was a pretty well-connected artistic family. In Chicago in 1911, they wanted him to go to Capri to paint them at their villa there, but it didn't work out. And I should say that another important effect of all this was that it lifted Sorolla's social standing, not just financially, but in terms of he's starting to deal as a peer with his circle of Huntington's friends, so that he's on boards of trustees now and so forth. The king comes to visit his house, as well as pay him to do portraits. And another important aspect of this is the ethnography in many of the pictures that were exhibited, because Mr. Huntington always wanted to illustrate Spain. And that will become extremely important. This is a work from 1907, and it's planting the seeds for Sorolla to do a mural commission for the Society. They talked about it all through 1911. There were sketches. A contract was signed in Paris in November 1911. Just as a footnote, after he signed the contract, he went and made a portrait of Porfirio Diaz, who was in exile in Paris that same week. Really nice picture, Porfirio Diaz. But that's not our story here. You've seen the gouache studies that are up in the gallery. There are a great many of those. Here is the initial installation. This is 1923, before they were open to the public, when they were first hung in the room. Here is not the portrait I showed you before of Vega Inclán, but another one. This is the Marquis of Jerez, whose rare book collection we have. And there were finally open to the public in 1926. Notice the bookcases below. And this, whoops, next slide. This shrine to Sorolla that we have still imitated to some extent now. And the other wall of Castilla, again with the bookcases. Subsequently, the room was used for various different things. Here it is at night. It was always best at night, even in the old days. And they started putting counters in the middle. It had been a reading room before the murals were put in, and it started to become a reading room and other things like that afterwards. And slowly, you were removed from the paintings. So when we redid the room from 2007 to 2010, we got rid of the counters, we got rid of the bookshelves, we lowered the paintings half a meter, 20 inches. This is air handling casework. Now, these are two views stuck together by me, so the wall doesn't break like that. I just wanted you to give a sense of the sweep of these things, because they're almost 12 feet tall and 197 running feet of painting. Here, we've also put much thinner frames on them, beautiful cherry frames to match the casework, and lighten the walls and reform the skylight and did a lot of other things. Now, we need to pause to consider the effect that the murals had on Sorolla's reputation and his art. Although Sorolla continued to send works to exhibitions in 1912 to 19, his major efforts as an artist through nearly a decade of immense productivity went into works that few ever saw in his lifetime. Even he never saw them together. And therefore, when his incapacitation happened in 1920, these things kind of went into a deep freeze, only to come out in 23 and not even be shown until 26. Also around 1910, Sorolla's works were going into a new and exciting direction of advanced abstraction. And works like the Siesta of 1911 are really very exciting. They can be, interestingly enough, compared to Sargent's watercolors, but he's playing around in a little work of art, and this is a picture over life-size figures. In the collection, this work by Ryan of full-scale figures again, where the Impressionist type technique is blown up and fragmenting. It's a very interesting effect to do that kind of picture big. You can compare it with the Café de Novedades that Ryan commissioned. Ryan was a little more adventurous than Mr. Huntington as a patron. It's really a wonderfully abstract painting and energetic, and there's something getting going there that's sidetracked by the mural commission. Interesting to compare Sorolla and an exact contemporary, Friedrich Frieseke, the Midwestern artist, who had the house next to Monet's. Have you ever read Monet's letters from Givenchy? He says, "Oh, the place is getting overrun with Americans. I'm getting out of here." Frieseke, the model here is almost certainly his wife. And in fact, for both figures, the model is almost certainly his wife. And before you jump to the conclusion, the American shows a nude in France, and the Spaniard shows a sedate family scene. But ladies, don't you want this dress? Isn't that a nice dress? Mrs. Sorolla and her daughters were really well turned out. Just one spectacular dress after the other. You see a couple in the exhibition here. But I do have to give Clotilde equal time with Mrs. Frieseke, although, of course, she was quite a bit older than the other woman, so I should have to go back in Sorolla's Irv to show you a comparison. And if you look at the late portraits of 1919 and 20, there seems to be that he was kind of beginning to pick up a little bit on this more advanced way, this beautiful thing of Clotilde in the garden, and then when we have a Gregorio Marañón. But he was cut down, and it never was to be. Now let's talk a little bit about the influence on the Hispanic Society of Sorolla. And the most important thing is approximately 1/4 of our exhibition space is dedicated to him, which is a pretty important little note. We really are Sorolla in a lot of ways, or at least 25% of us. At the same time, Starkweather became a curator at the Society, and Leonard Williams became a go-to author, not only for Sorolla, but in general things, for the Society. The ethnographic interest of Sorolla was also multiplied in many other artists. I'm showing you here Benedito Vives, Eugenio Hermoso, and Álvarez de Sotomayor. And this continued in Mr. Huntington's increasingly rare purchases after 1920. For example, the works of Jose Maria Lopez Mezquita, who Mr. Huntington sent out on campaigns, imitating in some ways those of Sorolla. I'm showing you a mayor of what is now a suburb of Valencia, and this beautiful image in the Palmeral of Elche, which appears in the murals. However, other things were happening in the teens in America, above all the Armory Show of 1913, when international modernism came to New York. Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, and this amazing gallery with Brancusi and Lembrook and a lot of other wonderful modernist artists and a Hodler in the back, so that there was a different wave breaking on the beaches of America. By 1926, the year in which the works were installed posthumously in New York, Sorolla's bravura realist style was rapidly becoming dépassé. And although Mr. Huntington continued to patronize proto-modernist artists such as Joaquin Mir, you've got a very nice Mir outside as well, and Anglada Camarasa, he refused to buy Picasso, Gris, Miro, Dali, whom he considered French artists. Thereafter, caught in the pincers of a triumphant modernism, on the one hand, on the other, the eclipse of Spain as a cultural and intellectual entity during the Franco years, Sorolla's star went into a steep decline. It was not long before one heard critics sneering at the Society's pictures as tourist art. Now, the general subject of artist reputations has been sporadically investigated, and your catalog has some wonderful resources for that, and I want to call attention to Christina Domenech's important contribution in the catalog. But we may summarize the issue by saying that Sorolla is an archetypical example of an artist for whom the right time and the right place soon crashed into obscurity. This could be said of anything relating to Spain in the 1930s. The only acceptable Spanish artists were those in the School of Paris. It's still the dogma at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. You don't see these other people. If you want to see them, you come here, you come to New York. Very interesting. I just want to point this out. The 1951 1,000 peseta note with Valencia on the back of it, and I suddenly realized that this is the Blanca. This is the portrait of Sorolla taken from a photograph when he was already sick. And of all the ironies of putting a regionalist painting on the principal currency of an utterly centralistic fascist regime. Well, since then, things have turned around quite a bit. Now these pictures in a regionalized Spain, in a regionalized Europe, look pretty modern, and people can appreciate their abstract qualities as well, as you do when you visit the exhibition upstairs. The efforts of people like Priscilla Muller and Edwin Peel and Florencio de Santa Anna, the former director of the Museum of Sorolla in Madrid, and above all, Blanca's epic efforts have lifted Sorolla up to the point where he is now obviously in Spain, but also increasingly throughout the world, a subject of veneration and critical esteem. 2.2 million people saw the murals when we circulated them in Spain. 468,000 people came to the Prado to see the one exhibit. And I hope you're having a good attendance here. I assume the line sometimes goes back to the French bakery around the corner, or wherever. Thus, in the year after the painter's sesquicentennial, we find Sorolla celebrated in this new exhibition and his works in a newly vigorous relationship with America. And we can only hope that our efforts will also find him beginning to receive again the critical acclaim that he has always deserved. And for us at the Society, we are, of course, eagerly awaiting every new notice of the increase in his reputation. Thank you.
Dr. Burke, it was just occurring to me, and I wish I could take credit for planning the symposium on this date for this reason, but it occurred to me that 105 years ago, 4 days ago, would have celebrated the 150th anniversary of the opening in New York, and we have similar weather. So I thought, I planned that too, so thank you very much. We are not having a break. We're going to plug right along, so please know we're informal. And if you wish to leave, to please exit through the back door, and if you intend not to return, to let Scott Winter Road know, so that we can let others in. We have a number of people waiting outside in an area. They're watching from another room, but it would be nice to be able to invite them to come in and join us. Our next speaker is Elisa Luxenberg. She's professor of 18th and 19th century European art at the University of Georgia, where she also serves as chair of the art history department. Previously, she taught at Princeton, Washington University in St. Louis, Ohio State University, and Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Luxenberg's research focuses primarily on, primarily on Franco-Spanish artistic confrontation and exchange, and 19th century photography. But these wide-ranging topics are linked by persistent concerns with naturalism and national identity. In her book published in 2008, she compares mid-19th century collections of Spanish art at the Louvre and at the Museo Nacional in Madrid. And this past year, she published a new book that represents a full critical study of a key work in 19th century travel literature, a French text about Spain by Baron Taylor.